In 1870, a photographer working from Mount Washington, New Hampshire, captured something on film that had no business existing: a dark, circular object hanging motionless above the summit. I want to be precise here. This image predates the first successful glider flight by 5 years. It predates the Wright brothers' powered flight at Kitty Hawk by 33 years. The photograph still sits in the archives of the New Hampshire Historical Society. No one has explained what it shows, but notice what makes this genuinely unsettling. It wasn't a one-time event. Between 1850 and 1903, photographic artists working across 3 separate continents recorded airborne objects that matched nothing in the technological inventory of their respective periods. These weren't static marks on glass plates. They moved, they hovered, they reappeared in exposures taken years apart, in locations separated by thousands of miles. And the flight paths they traced suggested something directed, something deliberate, not atmospheric drift or chemical artifact. The standard dismissals have always been tidy enough: optical defects in the camera body, stray light bleeding onto the plate, lens flare, birds frozen mid-flight, smeared into ambiguity by long exposures, debris on the glass, simple mistakes by operators still learning an infant medium. Then I started examining the actual photographs alongside the technical specifications of the equipment used and the professional credentials of the people behind the lens. These convenient explanations began falling apart. These were not amateurs stumbling through early experiments. These photographers ranked among the finest practitioners alive, operating top-grade instruments under favorable conditions. Every one of them recorded objects that had no rational explanation for being there. And the equipment constraints make the captures harder to wave away, not easier. Photography became commercially viable in the 1840s through the daguerreotype process. By 1850, the wet plate collodion method had sharply improved image resolution. Practitioners could render fine architectural detail, subtle gradations of light, even moving subjects with startling clarity. The cameras were large, cumbersome, demanding real technical skill, but they worked. They produced accurate representations of physical reality, which is precisely what makes the anomalies appearing in these records so difficult to rationalize. The Mount Washington photograph from 1870 represents the earliest rigorously documented case. It is nowhere near the first. In 1856, a French photographic artist named Pierre-Gustave Tour was documenting industrial development along the Seine River near Rouen. A textile magnate had commissioned him to produce a series showing the expansion of the factory district. Tour was known for exacting precision. He had trained under one of Daguerre's original students and spent a full decade refining his methods. His photographs carried such a reputation for accuracy that French courts admitted them as evidence in property disputes. Judges trusted what his lens recorded. In one of these industrial compositions, made on a clear August afternoon, an object appears in the sky above the factory complex. Cylindrical in form, darker than the surrounding cloud layer, angled sharply upward. The object is sharp and well-defined, nothing like the blur a bird would produce at Tour's typical exposure durations. It casts no visible shadow on the clouds below it, which suggests significant altitude. But the most telling detail isn't the object itself, it's the methodology behind the image. Tour captured 3 separate photographs from the exact same position that afternoon, carefully bracketing his exposures to document the full scene. The object appears in all 3 plates, but in slightly different positions. That detail matters. It indicates movement across the roughly 15-minute gap between each exposure. This photograph stayed in private hands for nearly a century before researchers surfaced it in the 1950s. Analytical specialists examined the original photographic plates with considerable rigor. No evidence of digital manipulation, no double exposure, no tampering of any kind. The anomalous object was burned directly into the original negative, exactly as it renders in the positive prints. But here's what I find more interesting than the object itself. Tor never mentioned it, not once in his personal notes. An artist of his technical skill, someone meticulous enough to bracket 3 exposures from an identical vantage point, and nothing. His journals offer zero commentary. Only the plates themselves testify to whatever was there. This pattern repeats. Different locations, different photographers, spanning the next 5 decades. In 1862, James Wallace Black produced what's broadly recognized as the first aerial photograph taken in the United States. He shot it from a tethered hot air balloon 1,200 feet above Boston. The image delivers a strikingly clear view of the downtown area. It also captures 2 distant objects that don't match the visual profile of other balloons. Too small, notably dark, and their apparent trajectory ran counter to the prevailing wind direction that day. Black noted in his personal journal that he spotted other balloons during ascent. These 2 entities behaved differently. They weren't tethered. They appeared to move independently. Then in 1870, the same year as the Mount Washington photograph, a series of images emerged from a sweeping photographic survey of the western United States. The federal government commissioned this project to catalogue mineral deposits and prospective railway routes. The photographers enlisted were experienced professionals, selected for their advanced technical capabilities. William Henry Jackson was among them. He'd later gained significant recognition for his stunning landscape work in Yellowstone, images instrumental in convincing Congress to designate the nation's first national park. Over the course of this survey, Jackson and his colleagues produced at least 7 photographs containing unexplained aerial objects. These appeared in images shot across Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. The forms varied, some spherical, others disc-like, a few almost triangular in aspect. Yet certain characteristics remained consistent. All registered dark against bright sky, all rendered sharply with none of the blur that accompanies motion. All appeared at substantial altitude, far above any ground features. What elevates these survey photographs beyond mere curiosity is the documentation surrounding them. Survey teams kept exhaustive records, weather conditions, exposure settings, technical annotations for every single plate, wind speeds, cloud formations, any atmospheric irregularities observed. And in the records corresponding to several photographs showing these objects, nothing, complete silence. The photographers logged clear skies, excellent visibility, ideal shooting conditions. Which means one of 2 things. Either these objects were invisible to the unaided eye, or the photographers simply didn't register them until development revealed what the plates had captured. That raises a genuinely unsettling question. How many other photographic plates from this period contained similar anomalous objects that no one ever noticed? These survey photographs endured repeated examination during the expedition and across the years that followed. Yet the aerial anomalies went unnoticed until researchers launched a systematic review of historical photographic archives in the 1960s. How many other collections sitting in museums and historical societies contain evidence of this same phenomenon? Evidence unexamined and unremarked for over a century. In 1883, an astronomer at the Zacatecas Observatory in Mexico captured something extraordinary. José Bonilla was performing routine solar observations when he photographed what he described as a spindle-shaped object crossing the disk of the sun. At first, he assumed birds or insects were drifting past his telescope, but as hours passed, he realized these objects occupied an altitude and distance no bird could reach. Over 2 days, He documented 447 of them. The photographs show dark, elongated forms, each transiting the Sun along the same directional vector at roughly the same altitude. Bonilla published his findings in a Mexican scientific journal. The international astronomical community barely acknowledged it. The dominant explanation? He'd accidentally photographed high-altitude geese, or perhaps wind-borne debris from a volcanic eruption. But here's what contemporary analysis reveals. Advanced image processing of Bonilla's original plates indicates these objects were positioned at least 250 miles above the Earth's surface. That's not atmosphere, that's space. Each object measured between 150 and 450 meters in length. Birds do not fly through the vacuum of space. Volcanic ejecta does not hold cohesive formation across 2 consecutive days of observation. The pattern continues into the 1890s. In 1894, Richard Nafala, an experienced marine photographic artist in Guernsey, documented a regatta in the English Channel. His photograph captures sailing vessels and spectator boats with the crisp precision expected of period marine photography. It also captures 3 objects in the sky above the fleet. They're arranged in a triangular formation, dark, disc-shaped, clearly positioned at considerable altitude above the vessels below. Nafala understood lens flares, reflections, and common photographic distortions, the full catalogue of visual artifacts that plagued the medium. He offered no explanation for what appeared in his image. Between 1896 and 1897, something strange swept across the United States. Newspapers in more than a dozen states reported sightings of what became known as mystery airships. Thousands of people described large, illuminated, dirigible-like craft moving over cities and farmland, most often at night. The accounts diverged wildly. Some witnesses described cigar-shaped vessels. Others reported triangular configurations. A few insisted they could make out propellers and distinct cabin structures. Officials dismissed these reports as mass hysteria, misidentified planets and stars, outright fabrications. But during this exact period, several photographers managed to capture images bearing striking resemblance to what witnesses described. A photograph taken in Omaha in April of 1897 shows a dark, elongated object suspended above the city skyline. Another from Fort Worth, same month, reveals what appears to be a structured craft with a pronounced, pointed frontal section. Even accounting for the grainy quality of these nighttime exposures, something remains difficult to dismiss. These are photographic records produced by local photographers, people with no apparent reason to fabricate anything. The dominant skeptical framework for this airship wave hinges on mass hysteria. Sensationalized newspaper stories, the theory goes, primed suggestible witnesses to misidentify stars and planets as extraordinary craft. But that framework hits a wall almost immediately. The phenomenon started before the press coverage did. The earliest credible reports came from isolated rural communities in California, witnesses with no connections to one another. Limited access to the newspapers supposedly fueling the delusion. The media didn't seed the sightings, it chased them. And the photographic evidence, crude as it is, indicates that at least some of these observers were documenting something physically present. By 1903, the year the Wright brothers achieved controlled, sustained, powered flight, the photographic record already held multiple images of aerial objects exhibiting what appeared to be advanced flight characteristics. The paradox here is stark. If these objects were sophisticated aircraft, then someone achieved powered flight well before the Wright brothers. Someone operating technology that left almost no other footprint, no patents filed, no laboratories uncovered, no experimental wreckage, no public demonstrations. Nothing except scattered photographs and eyewitness accounts. If they were not aircraft, Then what exactly did these cameras capture? The most straightforward alternative points to natural phenomena: unusual cloud formations, atmospheric optical effects, celestial bodies distorted by rare conditions. Photographers who simply lacked the scientific vocabulary to classify what they saw. That explanation works for some of the images. It does not work for all of them. It cannot account for objects displaying clear structural features. It cannot explain their appearance across multiple photographs showing obvious positional changes. And it offers no framework for why these phenomena clustered within specific time windows and geographic corridors. A third possibility demands attention, one that's considerably harder to sit with: that these objects were exactly what they looked like: aerial craft, but not human-made. 19th century aviation technology could not produce anything even approaching what these photographs depict. So if we take the photographic evidence seriously, we're forced toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Something, or someone, was operating advanced aircraft over multiple nations for at least 50 years before humanity officially achieved powered flight. That is not a minor footnote. That is a fundamental challenge to the accepted historical timeline. If we grant that these photographs show real objects, actual craft of some kind, then a cascade of questions follows. Who built them? Where did they originate? And why is there virtually no corroborating physical evidence? No wreckage recovered, no crash sites documented, no components identified, nothing but images on photographic plates and words from witnesses. The economic implications alone are staggering. If advanced aircraft existed between the 1850s and 1890s, then the entire Industrial Revolution unfolded beneath a technology that was never adopted, never reverse-engineered, never commercialized. It would mean the conventional story of aviation, that careful progression from gliders to powered aircraft to modern jets, was running in parallel with something demonstrably more advanced. A technology that somehow stayed invisible to the very engineers, inventors, and industrialists who were pouring their lives into solving the problem of flight. Think about the economic landscape for a moment. Railroad expansion was rewriting the rules of commerce, minting fortunes overnight. Steam power was transforming manufacturing at every level. Telegraph cables were stitching the globe together. Technology wasn't just advancing, it was being absorbed into industry almost immediately. If someone had demonstrated a working aircraft in 1870, capital would have flooded in within weeks. Military interest would have been immediate and aggressive. Commercial applications would have followed before the ink dried on the first reports. The financial incentives were staggering. And yet, these objects show up in photographs. Thousands of witnesses describe them during the Airship wave. And then silence. No patents filed. No companies incorporated. No military procurement initiated. The only economic explanation that holds is that whatever this technology was, it simply wasn't available for adoption. Now consider a different framework. If these craft belonged to an entity indifferent to profit, uninterested in military contracts, with zero motivation to compete against railroads or steamships, something observing human economic development rather than participating in it, then the pattern starts to make sense. Modern forensic tools have allowed researchers to examine these historical images with precision that didn't exist when the photographs were taken. Digital enhancement, resolution scaling, geometric analysis of object placement and proportion, all of this has produced findings worth careful attention. First, multiple objects across different photographs, from different eras, from entirely different locations, exhibit consistent geometric proportions. Disc-shaped objects, where they appear, tend to show diameter to thickness ratios that cluster within narrow parameters. That pattern implies one of two things: either a shared natural phenomenon generating these shapes, or a common engineering methodology behind manufactured artifacts. I want to be precise here. Natural formations capable of producing disc-like shapes in atmosphere, lenticular clouds, for instance, do not maintain sharp edges and uniform proportions across varying weather conditions. Manufactured objects would. Second, these objects demonstrate what engineers call aspect stability. When captured in multiple frames from the same photographic session, showing slight positional changes, they hold their orientation relative to the ground. They don't tumble, they don't rotate at random the way a balloon or wind-blown debris would. This points to one of two conclusions: either atmospheric conditions of extraordinary rarity providing inherent stabilization, or onboard control systems maintaining orientation deliberately. In 1870, primitive gyroscopic stabilization existed for maritime navigation. Practical application to airborne vehicles was decades from realization. Third, and this is where conventional explanations strain hardest, several photographs capture objects at altitudes that defy easy dismissal. The Mount Washington image was shot from 6,288 feet elevation. The object in that frame sits above the photographer's position. Minimum altitude, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 feet. At that height in 1870, no human-built apparatus could sustain flight. Period. Birds can reach those altitudes on rare occasions, but the object bears no resemblance to any avian form or flight behavior. Then there's José Bonilla's observations from 1883, and these push the problem to an entirely different scale. If the altitude calculations hold, and modern analysis strongly suggests they do, he was photographing objects in space. In 1883, objects that appeared to move in formation, holding consistent spacing and orientation across a 2-day observation window. A meteor shower doesn't explain this. Meteors don't fly in formation. They don't maintain uniform shapes. They don't cross the solar disk at steady velocities over extended periods. What's also worth noting is the geographic clustering of these photographic events. They aren't scattered evenly across the globe. They concentrate in identifiable patterns. The western United States shows particularly high density during the 1870s survey expeditions. The English Channel and northern France yield multiple incidents spanning the 1860s through 1890s. Central Mexico produces prominent examples concentrated in the 1880s. These clusters defy easy explanation. They do not align with population density or the volume of photographic work in a given region. Several of the most photographically prolific cities of the era, London and New York among them, show a remarkably low incidence of these anomalous images. Then there is the temporal pattern, difficult to disregard once you see it. The phenomenon intensifies through the 1850s, reaches its zenith during the 1890s airship wave, and then largely vanishes by the early 1900s. That timing coincides precisely with the dawn of practical human aviation. As though whatever had been operating in those skies for half a century stopped once humanity started flying on its own. Coincidence is one explanation. Another is that the operators of these craft concluded their observational window once humans independently achieved powered flight. The economic dimension deepens the puzzle considerably when you examine who was witnessing these phenomena and where. Railroad surveyors crossing remote Western territories, industrial photographers methodically cataloguing factory expansion, astronomers stationed at isolated observatories, crews aboard seafaring vessels. These are not environments that breed hoaxes or mass hysteria. These were seasoned professionals. Many worked alone or in small teams. They had no discernible motive to fabricate stories or tamper with photographic plates. And here is what I find genuinely difficult to dismiss. They were positioned at locations uniquely advantageous for observing nascent economic and industrial development. If someone intended to study an emerging industrial civilization, these are precisely the vantage points one would choose. Railroad construction was opening vast new territories, laying the transportation spine for continental commerce. Factories were reshaping manufacturing and seeding new industrial centers. Astronomical work was expanding humanity's grasp of the cosmos. Shipping lanes were binding continents into an increasingly integrated global economy. The technological gap here is staggering. The Wright Flyer of 1903 employed a custom-built gasoline engine generating 12 horsepower. Carefully engineered wings with specific airfoil profiles. A sophisticated control system using wing warping and movable rudders. An exceptionally lightweight frame of spruce wood and muslin fabric. That machine's inaugural flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. The objects visible in these historical photographs appear to operate at elevated altitudes. They exhibit sustained hovering capability. They maintain stable flight across varied atmospheric conditions. Their structural configurations resemble nothing from the nascent period of aviation, nothing even close. For secret innovators to have built these craft between the 1850s and 1890s, they would have needed to solve every problem that consumed the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtiss, Alberto Santos Dumont, and scores of others across many subsequent years. They would have needed propulsion systems that did not exist, materials that were commercially unobtainable, fabrication techniques not developed for decades, all accomplished without wind tunnels, without systematic aerodynamic research, without the painstakingly accumulated knowledge that aviation pioneers slowly built upon. The financial burden alone would have been enormous. Early aviation trailblazers poured vast resources into developing their flying machines. The Wright brothers funded their work through a bicycle business and operated under constant financial strain. These pioneers worked in full public view, filed patents, demonstrated their aircraft openly, and still struggled to attract investors and buyers. The economic logic collapses under its own weight. If someone in the 1850s or 1860s had engineered sophisticated aerial craft, funding decades of research, conducting test flights over populated areas in broad daylight, secrecy becomes almost impossible to justify. You don't hide a breakthrough like that. You patent it. You attract investors. You build a company. The military applications alone would have been worth millions. Freight transport, passenger transit, the commercial potential would have reshaped entire economies. The incentive to disclose was overwhelming. And yet, nothing substantial. Photographs, scattered eyewitness accounts, then silence. This forces a deeper question about how we reconstruct the past from evidence. We have photographic documentation. We have first-hand observer accounts. We have recorded observations from trained specialists working with calibrated instruments. By any conventional standard of historical research, this material demands serious examination. But it contradicts the accepted timeline of technological development. So it gets set aside, quietly disregarded. The default response is to challenge the evidence itself. Maybe the photographs were doctored. Maybe the witnesses were confused. Maybe natural explanations exist that haven't been identified yet. That's reasonable skepticism. I want to be precise here, and it has its place. But applied uniformly, it creates problems. Many of these photographic records come from sources whose integrity is otherwise unquestioned. Government survey photographers whose other work gets cited without hesitation. Professional astronomers whose celestial observations form the foundation of accepted science. Commercial photographers whose technical skill no one disputes. The witness testimony proves harder to dismiss than most people assume. The airship sighting wave between 1896 and 1897 produced thousands of reports across numerous states. Some observers were certainly mistaken. Planets, stars, atmospheric oddities misread as vehicles. But specific reports involved multiple witnesses, daylight encounters, detailed structural descriptions of craft seen at close range. Among those witnesses, former military officers, newspaper editors, law enforcement officials, scientists. These were not easily confused individuals glimpsing shapes in dark skies. They were trained professionals making careful observations. When you set the photographic evidence alongside witness testimony and astronomical data from observers like José Bonilla, something accumulates that resists easy dismissal. Something was happening. The real question is what, precisely? And none of this is hidden. The photographs sit in archives,